Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's installment of Stat Plus Conversations, our weekly video chat series exclusively for Stat Plus subscribers. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Megan Thielking. I'm a news editor here at Stat. And in just a few minutes, I will be joined by Casey Ross, Stat's national technology correspondent. Just to run through a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a few icons. You can use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or send a message directly to the Stat team, but we won't be taking questions directly from that chat. We will be taking questions though. You just need to use the Q&A feature to type it and we'll try to answer it during this discussion. You'll also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote the ones that you would like to see us answer. And we will be taking questions throughout the entire conversation, so feel free to start asking them now. You don't need to hold off till the end of the chat. With that, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker for today. Please welcome Casey Ross, National Technology Correspondent here at STAT.
Hey, Megan, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Casey?
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So Casey, you obviously had this big investigation come out this week, looking at Epic and its healthcare algorithms and its business practices. Let's dive right in and get started with the investigation itself, because you've got a lot of great material in it. Walk us through what you found.
Yeah, so as you said, this was an investigation of Epic's efforts to deploy artificial intelligence algorithms, predictive algorithms in EHRs, in the context of EHRs used by hospitals around the country. And sort of the findings fit into kind of three buckets. The first is performance issues with those algorithms. Health systems are plugging in those algorithms, they're testing them, they're running in the pilots. They're running them otherwise, and they're finding that when they do so, they are not meeting the accuracy level that they would have anticipated, and that's included in the testing that was done by Epic in the model briefs it provides, on how those algorithms were built. In some cases, like with the sepsis algorithm, they're finding that when they run it in their systems, they're finding that it doesn't catch the onset of sepsis, that it misses a lot of cases, that there are a lot of false alarms. I tried to stick in evaluating the algorithms to those that had some some research that was published behind them. Easier to engage in conversations about that, and then and really kind of dig into those issues. The second sort of pillar of the story was the honor roll program, which is a program that Epic runs to incentivize the use of various technology services that it provides, and it provides payments to providers for sort of technology best practices, and incentives are tied in part to the adoption of algorithms that are developed by Epic or developed by others. And so we were taking a look at whether those incentives have had effects of increasing the uptake of algorithms that may have questionable reliability. Then the third issue is sort of transparency in the way that Epic goes about disclosing the details of its models, and how research is conducted or is not conducted on them. Some of the questions about the tension between protecting intellectual property and sort of allowing open scientific inquiry that's really needed on products like this that have a direct effect on patients.
Yeah, and you touched on this a little bit, but just to follow up, can you give the audience a sense of what the landscape of published research looks like? Because that was a factor that you had to consider, obviously, like you said in your reporting, but there's also complications that make that research harder to conduct.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of published studies. University of Michigan has published on the sepsis algorithm and deterioration index. Duke has published on the readmissions algorithm. Washington University in St. Louis has not published its findings, but there's an abstract publicly available about the effort to validate the sepsis algorithm within its system. University of California at San Francisco has also published on the algorithm to predict no-shows. And then there are other institutions which have plugged in the algorithm and have run research and done studies on its use that have found favorable outcomes from their use. And those were described to me, but have not yet been published.
Yeah. And so in the story published yesterday morning, what's the response been thus far?
Yeah, I mean, first off, a lot of people are reading it and engaging in it, which is really great. It's gotten a lot of readership. My notifications are like a traffic accident on Twitter. There's just a lot of that, and it was published. The Verge published a piece on it on our investigation today, and different parts of the federal government have reached out to me about it. So there's a lot of inquiry surrounding it. There is that usual sort of parade of hating on Epic, which is sort of a subgenre almost of reaction to these stories, which I don't find constructive, which doesn't really add to the dialogue. So there's some of that, but in the constructive realm, there are a lot of people that are really engaging with important questions, about what are the next steps, about how to ensure transparency, how should these be validated, what are the questions that come up in the validation that need to be really sussed out by providers and developers of algorithms on a national level. So all that is really great to see. There are, of course, more people who want to read this story that is paywalled. And sort of there are always those questions about why is this paywalled? Everybody wants a free lunch, but it takes an awful lot of time and effort and money to produce this journalism. All the people on this call, I want to thank for being here and supporting our journalism. We really have to, be able to pay to continue to do this work. So that support is just so invaluable to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And, talking about engagement and who has been engaging with the story, let's talk about Epic and what Epic is saying, and sort of what your interactions with the company look like as you were going about doing this reporting.
Yeah, I haven't heard from Epic since the story ran. I spoke with Epic via email and initially sought to have interviews with their data science team about the various products. They preferred to provide responses to my questions in writing. So they did provide those responses, and I incorporated those into the story. As far as what they had to say, working off of those three pillars that I mentioned before of the story on the performance problems, the story really spent the most time with the sepsis algorithm. And they're pointing out that with regard to the published research, which we referenced in the story by Washington and Michigan, those institutions are using different definitions of sepsis onset than Epic necessarily uses. So when they plug in the algorithms based on deployment along using these different definitions, then they're going to generate results which are different from what Epic generated, and that's an important point to consider. I think you also want to consider that those institutions are doing that because they don't find that the definition used by Epic necessarily supports how they want to care for their patients, the issues within sepsis care that are relevant to them. On the honor roll front, Epic points out that its honor roll program, is meant to incentivize the uptake of technologies that will benefit patients. Epic has a lot of technology solutions, and they believe in them, and they want people to use them. And so you can see why it is they would have a program like this. As it pertains to the algorithmic component of that, Epic gives honor roll credit to institutions based on using algorithms that are developed by Epic or by others, by other developers, by hospitals that build their own algorithms. Of course, the thing that makes Epic's algorithms stand out, what makes them most attractive in the marketplace, is the fact that they're embedded in their software offerings, that they can be used quickly and that they can be deployed by health systems. The other issue on the transparency front, Epic points out that as far as transparency goes, they offer the model details to all the users of the products, and that's the approach that they've taken to protect their intellectual property. They've kept them behind a corporate firewall. So you don't know, if you're not an Epic user, exactly how these algorithms are built or work. And that's by design. But that also may have consequences in terms of people's ability to replicate these, to test them, to understand how they work.
Yeah, this gives me like 17 follow-up questions, but let's start with, you obviously talked to a number of Epic's customers in your reporting, and you heard and really incorporated into your story a lot of nuance in terms of the way that Epic's customers talk about the algorithms and what they found and how they use them and how much they rely on them. What are you hearing from people who use Epic's systems, and what's going on with those different variations and what people are experiencing?
Yeah, there is I mean, Epic's sort of user community is not a monolith. There are different systems which are using these algorithms in different ways, and some are finding that they are useful and some are finding that they are not useful. So there's a lot of discussion, a very active discussion underway, I think, in this community about how these products help or don't help, and one of the sort of problems to suss out in all of this is that systems are making decisions about how to calibrate these, how to deploy them in their systems, how to set the alarms, how to set the scoring thresholds for when an algorithm alerts. They're making different decisions about where the algorithm ought to be used, in what setting. Should it be used in the ICU? Should it be used in the emergency department? Should it be used on inpatient floors? Should it be used in all three? And so you see a lot of difference there about how the decisions that individual institutions are making. And so there's a big, broad discussion about that. I think among a lot of users, there's concern about that variability. There's a lot of concern about the performance issues that they've been seeing in some setting, in some organizations. And there's a big discussion about what to do about it. I mean, should these be regulated in some way? Who should be doing the regulating? Should it be a public-private partnership? Should it be the FDA?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to circle back to the regulation question, but I'm going to take a question from Ashley, who asks, who says, first of all, AI can add value to people and institutions, which is something that your story touches on too, the potential and the promise. And she asks, what do you think organizations building AI should do to ensure their models are ethical and work to drive outcomes? So looking at what are the next steps on the institutional level?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the productive approaches that I saw from institutions that are using Epic's algorithms is, having internal, committees that are vetting these products, clinical committees and ethics committees that are carefully auditing these products and testing them and understanding how they work in different demographic subgroups. For example, how do they work by age? How do they work by sex? How do they work in those different racial subgroups and people with different comorbidities? Things like that are really, really important to examine. And you only do that in a fulsome way, in a way that really supports successful implementation, if you have a broad group of stakeholders within your community, within your institution, that understand machine learning, understand artificial intelligence, and understand all the relevant clinical questions which come to bear on the care of critically ill patients, like patients with sepsis.
Right. And you make this point in the story, but that's the span of Epic's customers is quite wide. Like, there are massive academic medical centers that have data science teams that can do this, and there are small hospitals that use Epic for their systems that might not necessarily have these huge data science teams, right?
Yeah, and it's a huge issue to sort of try to explore here is, in hospital systems with different levels of resources, what does that mean about their approach to validation, of the algorithms? How much scrutiny can they put to bear on them as compared to a large academic medical center like a Duke or Stanford or Cleveland Clinic or Mayo Clinic? The resources are not consistent across the board, and I'm afraid neither are the validation approaches, which just raises questions about, whether or not all patients whose care is guided by these algorithms are getting the same rigor, the same approach, the same sort of support for the use of these systems in their care.
Yeah. And there's another question and comment from one of the audience members named Lynn, who says patients are subject to the recommendations of these algorithms, certainly in some situations. Why aren't they told that AI has made recommendations for their care? Which is something we've reported on in STAT before. How much do you feel like, and I know this wasn't the subject of your story, how much do you feel like these issues are rising to the forefront of patients rather than providers or hospital executives or whoever else is involved?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the particular domain in which the algorithm is working, but by and large, I don't think institutions are at all disclosing, the use of algorithms in their care. And I think they're not doing that because they consider these part of the tool for the clinical assessment. So they're just sort of saying, well, we lean on this information that's provided to help support your care, but we're also using our own clinical judgment and clinical intuition to help guide the decision-making process. So not everyone feels in all context as though it's necessarily important to disclose to a patient that an algorithm is being used. But I think there needs to be more awareness in general in patient communities about the fact that these tools are running, how they are being validated. I mean, all of it is kind of happening behind a curtain right now that is really not very well understood. And I think it's incumbent upon providers and developers of algorithms to educate people about the use of these tools, because they do have a direct bearing on care.
Yeah. I mean, it gets to this topic that we keep coming back to, which is the issue of transparency. And you were talking about how all of the Epic's customers are not a monolith. There's a lot of variation there in how they're discussing this, how they're using these tools. But it's also true that the companies that are developing algorithms like the ones that Epic is working on are also not a monolith. Just based on your reporting, what did you find in terms of how Epic differs or is similar to the other companies that are in this space in terms of transparency or in terms of the research on their products?
Yeah, I mean, as far as Epic and its research and how it goes about the validation and communication, all of it sort of happens behind that corporate firewall, which there's no sunlight on, there's no awareness of, unless there is some kind of a study that's published in a medical journal, which would be done by the user. And we've started to see some of those studies come out. Epic itself is not publishing research or necessarily collaborating with those institutions in the research in the way that some other algorithm developers are. I think there's been a rising level of awareness and changing approaches over time to this question, which is important to think about. Epic was first, to this. They're really the first to incorporate predictive algorithms in the EHR, which is to their great credit in terms of the innovation that they've brought to the market. As they've been doing that, I think there have been different approaches to validation, to research. There's been, kind of a broader enlightenment going on about the issues that arise, when those questions aren't carefully sussed out. One company that just launched is named Bayesian Health out of Johns Hopkins, which also has a sepsis algorithm. And they launched the product by doing a prospective study. They studied it in care in hospitals. So they're launching this product, having done a real careful analysis of how the product performed in a live clinical setting. And I think you're going to see some of that. That's not the way that Epic has approached it to date.
Yeah. And another big part of Epic's approach that you touched on at the top, I'd love to get into a little more, is this honor roll program that provides payments from Epic to its customers to adopt algorithms, just sort of across the board. And we actually had a question from Laura Eldon about this too, just why it makes business sense for Epic, what sort of the thinking is behind this business model. Can you give us a little bit more detail on what you found out about the honor roll program and what potential problems it might pose?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a number of health systems and reviewed a lot of press releases that health systems put out when they achieved the honor roll designation. And, what I learned about it is that, from Epic's standpoint, what it seems they're trying to achieve is the use of solutions that Epic and others develop that it believes represent the best practices for the use of their technology and other technologies in the care of patients. That's broadly, what the goal is. As it pertains to algorithms that have not been fully scientifically vetted, that can be problematic because systems don't necessarily know how these are going to perform in practice, yet a requirement of the program is that a system adopt a predictive algorithm, particularly for sepsis. That's one that's Epic said it requires. Epic did not answer a lot of my questions about the honor roll program. They did not answer how the specific criteria are applied, how much money they've awarded, exactly how these determinations are made, how the actual financial payments are structured. So there are a lot of questions about that still need to be sort of sussed out and answered.
Yeah. And speaking of questions, if folks have, I know there's a couple questions still in the queue, but just a reminder to folks that you can submit questions and I'll try to weave them in as we go through the conversation. There's a question here from Michael on how this will impact FDA's draft guidance on clinical decision support software. Can you actually, before answering that question, which is a good one, give us a sense of what the regulatory landscape looks like right now and sort of what oversight does or doesn't entail at this point? And then what do you think the next steps might look like?
Yeah, these products that work within the EHR right now are not very closely regulated at all by FDA or anybody else. I think there's been, for better or worse, and my reporting would suggest in this story for worse, that there just hasn't been scrutiny of these kinds of products that are running in the background of the care of critically ill patients. I think that line has caused the FDA to focus much more on decision support in imaging critical specialties. You see the FDA is regulating AI products, that are used to guide the care of patients in cancer, in pulmonary specialties, in neurology, in cardiology, in others where there's a lot of imaging data which is used. And there just is not a lot of scrutiny on the products that are otherwise working within the EHR using medical data to make predictions of various kind that support the operations or clinical decisions of hospitals.
Yeah. And I guess the second part of this question is a little crystal ball-y from Michael, but will the FDA lean towards software as a medical device? Do you see any sense of the tides changing around how FDA might approach the rest of these products?
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of discussion going on within the FDA about this right now. And I think there's a lot of conversation among the stakeholders within Epic's community and outside Epic's community, about what ought to be done, how this ought to be approached. One of the suggestions that was brought up in the course of my conversation with a lot of Epic's clients was, the idea that there needs to be some kind of a public-private partnership that would register algorithms, that would put them in the public sphere, that would then also create standards, perhaps even testing laboratories around the country that could then run these algorithms and then examine and report on their limitations, how they work within particular demographic subgroups, whether there's a particular clinical indication that might be tied to an algorithm, or a sense that, well, this algorithm does not work for patients, does not tend to work as well, or the AUC, the accuracy level is lower for patients with certain comorbidities. Those kinds of things are the really important questions that people think ought to be examined. The question is, who's going to do sort of the examining? Is it going to be a private public effort, or is it going to be a government effort, and where would it be more effective?
Yeah. And just in terms of, thinking about what the FDA does or doesn't regulate, sort of the areas where there's less oversight right now, you mentioned FDA is looking at things like products that are being used in cancer care. Sepsis kind of, to an extent, falls a little bit more outside that window, and you focused a lot on Epic's sepsis algorithm in the story. Most of the reporting is really focused on this sepsis algorithm. Can you explain why that is and sort of what has raised the most alarms about that particular tool?
Yeah, I've focused on sepsis for a couple of reasons. One is because there's published research on it, and there are some really pressing questions. There have been recent studies done. The one at the University of Michigan is the one that has gotten the most recent attention about their attempt to sort of retrospectively validate the algorithm. And so the proximity of those questions and the important questions that are sort of raised in that research, I think are really, really important to understand and pull apart and examine and question and have a debate over. And so that's why I wanted to focus. Sepsis is also a really, really important use case. A lot of hospitals have deployed sepsis algorithms all over the country. Epic said that 180 of its customers have adopted its algorithm, which is an under sort of statement, because all of those 180 organizations, or many of them do, include many hospitals. You're talking about hundreds of hospitals which are using this. So it's having a bearing on the care potentially of an awful lot of people. And so it's a really, really important use case to examine and to make sure that it's being sort of adequately vetted and we understand what the results are.
Yeah. I mean, to your point about hospitals and the huge interest in adopting the sepsis algorithm in particular, a point that you raised in the story that I thought was really salient to this is, Epic is here sort of in one bucket in terms of how it's deployed and marketed its algorithms. Regulators are in another bucket where there's not a lot of oversight. And then hospitals are another bucket. Hospitals have been very eager to adopt new technologies for good reason, and which is that they want to address problems like this. So, I'm going to actually jump over to, there's a couple questions here about how we evaluate algorithms or how we improve rigor. So Ashley has a question. As we have more and more real-time data, algorithms can better solve problems. And this gets into more of like how they could be used in clinical trials. But I think the broader question here that's relevant to this story especially is, how do we marry rigor with models without losing the ability to adapt them in real time and better deliver outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, that's the huge,
yeah. Can you solve it?
question. Yeah, I mean, it's such a important insight embedded in that question. And I think these models can make huge differences in patient care. I mean, there is really amazing potential for algorithmic products if they are deployed in the right way to make a difference in the care of patients, to make sure that clinicians can get ahead of issues that right now they're falling behind on in some clinical circumstances like sepsis. If you don't get antibiotics in a timely fashion to patients, the research suggests that outcomes are far worse. And so there is some real potential, but there's an overwhelming sentiment that sort of came out in talking to customers and talking to others in this reporting was that it needs to slow down. It's moving too fast. These algorithms are getting in care before these questions can be adequately answered. And there needs to be a marrying in the way that this approach is taken, the way that these algorithms are tested and validated, that allows people to reach for that potential, but with real guardrails around it to make sure that they're used in the right way. And so I think we're going to see some suggestions coming forward about how best to do that, because a lot of people are focused on that question right now.
Yeah. We talked a lot about, and you've mentioned a lot of Epic's biggest clients. We talked about Duke and University of Michigan and Stanford, or UCI, somewhere in California. I'm sure a lot of Epic users. But, one thing that we haven't talked about as much is smaller hospitals, or like I said, hospitals that don't necessarily have the bandwidth. I mean, what do we still not know from sort of the perspective of those smaller Epic customers, and what do we still not know more broadly from your investigation? What questions are you still itching to have answered?
Yeah, I mean, it would be one of the most important questions I think that I was unable to answer in this story is, across all of those 180 customers who have adopted Epic sepsis algorithm, what does validation look like? Mm-hmm. What definitions of sepsis onset are they using? What resources are they able to apply? What does the communication look like with Epic about how these algorithms are deployed? Those questions, the answers to those questions determine whether or not these are going to be successful in care, what the accuracy is, whether they're actually benefiting patients. what level of research is actually going on, how much of it is prospective, how much of it is retrospective, what kinds of studies are being done, how do the different resources of the hospital systems affect their ability to carry out that very crucial work. I think that's one question. The other big question, I think, is on the honor roll incentives. Again, like, what are the criteria that are sort of being applied there? How is it affecting hospital decision making? And the honor roll, awards incentives based on the usual honor roll sort of distinctions: cum laude, magna cum laude, summa cum laude. So how are the algorithms in particular, and the use of the algorithms, incentivized differently across those different designations? What do you have to do, to get the designation? Specifically, what are the conversations taking place around that? How are the payments awarded and structured? I think those are important questions to answer, as well as they may sort of begin to sort of unravel questions about the suitability of this, any unintended consequences that may result from this. I mean, I heard a lot of hospitals have this conversation around the honor roll where they want to be on the honor roll, right? You want to be a good student, right? Like you want to get that distinction. You don't want to be a hospital that has a big name but isn't on the honor roll, right? But should that be the basis upon which you decide to adopt an algorithm? Should it be based on, in part, in some way, on whether or not you're getting financial incentives? Or should it just be based solely on, whether or not it's beneficial for the care of your patients?
That is a lot of unanswered questions. I mean, I think plenty more reporting to do. I think, on the question of the algorithms, and I think you touched on this in your story, well, it's difficult to answer those questions because of the lack of public criteria really that's available to look at or have people evaluate. Outside of Epic's clients, you talk to a number of other people in the industry. What do people say specifically about the questions that they have about the honor roll program?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest question was that question about, do the honor roll recipients, understand what they are getting when they are adopting algorithms, whether Epic's algorithm or another algorithm? Do they understand sort of all of the implications of that for their patients when they're adopting sort of the product? And, what kind of validation are they doing? Are they able to do? What processes are in place to make sure that when they're putting something in place, regardless of whether there are incentives tied to it, that it is performing, in the best way for their patients? I think those are really, important questions to kind of to dig into, and that that hopefully we'll be able to examine in greater depth.
Yeah. And that kind of gets me back to my follow-up question on your other set of unanswered questions, which is, do you think that there's a consensus yet, and you can answer this specifically about sort of the Epic ecosystem or more broadly, on how best to validate or vet these models?
No. No.
Okay.
I don't think there's any consensus, and I think it's also important to point out, as I did in the story, that Epic is not alone in this. They are one company. They are the largest company and the most visible company, but a lot of companies are deploying these algorithms and are reaching very different conclusions about, what level of information should be disclosed. A lot of companies are selling these very aggressively. And I think a lot of the pitfalls that were explained in the story are also common to others. And there is not any universal agreement about what are the steps that ought to be taken, even when guidelines have been developed about what ought to be disclosed. One of the studies I referenced in the story, this is on a preprint server, was by Stanford, which reviewed 15 different guidelines and then sort of compared them to what Epic discloses in its algorithm briefs, and found that Epic agrees with, reports 9 out of the 12 most commonly requested items, but then doesn't report on frequently on 75 other items that are requested from these guidelines. The guidelines are asking for like 200 different things in all these different categories. Most of them are about sort of pre-deployment questions about how the model was developed, but there also need to be a lot more focus on utility, about implementation science, about how you judge and assess reliability of these algorithms over time. And there's just, I think, an awakening about all of those questions in an effort to tackle them, but no consensus on the answers yet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that gets to a question that one of your sources raised in this story, which is, do customers, do hospitals know the right questions to ask? And if there's 200 right questions to ask or whatever number, is that really feasible in the sort of the system that we have set up right now to really be able to vet these?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people would say it needs to be, I mean, for the sake of the algorithm developers too, it's got to be simpler. Like, it's like people dislike the IRS, not just because they're the IRS, but because the rules always change. The rules can't change all the time. There's got to be a consistent, understandable set of criteria on which algorithms should be judged and vetted and validated and audited. And if there are not, then I just think it's very hard to assure quality.
Right. Yeah. And, this is a little bit of a tangent from this reporting, but it kind of harkens back to some of the past stories that you've done that have been really great, Casey, talking about, and I don't mean to imply at all that that's what's happening here, but I think the questions that you're raising are being raised more broadly about healthcare algorithms. I mean, what kind of momentum have you seen in the past 6 months or the past year to raise awareness about the potential for bias in algorithms, or essentially get the community really to stop and hit pause and say, like, let's evaluate what's happening here?
Yeah, I think there's been a really positive movement in the direction of understanding the drivers of bias within the deployment of algorithms. A lot of really important discussions and important science has been done, notably by Ziad Obermeyer and his group at the University of Chicago. There's, I think, a real awareness now of the potential for unintended consequences. Most of what Obermeyer's group has done has examined those issues within the context of health plans and sort of care management programs. I think there is a growing appreciation now of the extent of those issues within algorithms that providers routinely use as well. And I'm not talking about sophisticated machine learning algorithms necessarily, but algorithms in general, models that are used as heuristics to make decisions in an awful lot of clinical settings that can go off the rails because they were developed, on populations that are not non-diverse and not broadly representative. So it's an amazing thing that's happened, because I think the onset of machine learning and the use of those algorithms, because machine learning has the potential to really automate them and scale them, I think those questions about bias have become front and center, and people are really seeing the potential for harm that can result because of that. And I think there's a real effort to address it now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that gets to the stuff that you've talked about before in terms of the need for publishing, right? And the need for really independent and rigorous research. We had another story run on Monday about a different study, not relevant to Epic's algorithms, but the broader field of clinical decision support tools, that found there's almost no replication happening in the industry, right? Like, there's very little research going on to vet things, even what's been published on, very little research to then try to replicate what has been published.
Yeah, I mean, there's this notion of a reproducibility crisis within clinical decision support and algorithms in particular, which is a very real problem. It's not easy to do that research for a whole bunch of different, sort of structural reasons. Doing replication studies is not the type of stuff that tends to get published in the top tier medical journals. And yet it's very resource and labor intensive. So what researcher is going to have the budget, the time, the ability to do that kind of really intense work, which then doesn't actually support their academic career very much? So there's, maybe there's got to be a different venue for that. Maybe there's got to be a different organization or set of organizations that support that kind of work, because it is very hard to do in the context of these kinds of tools, because not all the data sets are transparent. There's intellectual property questions. there are real questions that have to be sorted out. I mean, it's not simple. And because of that complexity, I think it's been very hard to do, but I think it's really, really important to be able to reproduce science, because otherwise you don't know if it's,
Yeah.
rigorous and that the products will work.
Right. There's a question here. I think we've kind of touched on this answer already on sort of the other players in this domain, companies like Cerner. Your story mentioned Cerner, it mentioned some of the startups that are developing AI tools for use in healthcare. Can you give just like a quick overview, and I know you do this in the story too, of sort of where how Epic's approach to research, which is what we're talking about here, stacks up to some of its competitors or other people in the space?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see a lot of companies that are sort of actively engaging with their collaborators in co-published research that they do that, will appear on sites like Decina is one company that comes to mind that's working within this space, which, is making a pretty substantial effort in sort of generating research on the use of its products. Epic's approach, I think, is to allow and to support its customers in doing the research, but that research is not always easy because of various sort of barriers that are kind of endemic to the relationship with Epic. I mean, hospitals sign, these contracts, which are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, over $1 billion in some of the largest examples with Epic. So if the researchers then go and produce like harshly critical studies of Epic's products, then that creates a pretty awkward, relationship or problem in the relationship potentially. I mean, even Epic refers to these relationships as marriages, and that makes it much harder to produce that kind of independent research. I don't think the research that's done by any of the other organizations, the Cerner, the ones I've mentioned, is necessarily independent either. I mean, they're involved in it, and they have an interest in that research bearing out the value of their products, which really just points to the need for there to be independent, rigorous analysis of these products and these algorithms and how they affect care. So that's just, those are just all really important issues to sort of think through over the next, months and years.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a good forward-looking note to end on. So I think we've come up to the end of our time. So thank you again, Casey, for joining me today. And thanks to the audience for tuning in. We are hosting Step Plus Conversations every Tuesday around 1 p.m. each week. So be sure to sign up for our chat next week when my colleague Nicholas St. Fleur will be discussing how the new flagship firm Celerity recently raised $123 million to invent drugs by understanding cellular networks, which sounds like a great discussion. So we'll hope to see everybody next